The alarm tore through the shelter before I even opened my eyes. Red light spun across the walls of my cage, and the floor shook under a sound I had never heard before, a deep grinding roar coming from somewhere below the building. Doors slammed shut down the corridor, one after another, sealing every cage in the block. Mine did not seal. The lock on cage 9 had been broken for weeks, and nobody had bothered to fix it, because nobody thought I mattered enough to fix. Smoke crawled along the ceiling. I pressed myself into the corner of my cage and listened to the announcement system crackle out an evacuation order, calling every worker to the exits and saying nothing at all about the animals left behind. I understood then that I was going to be forgotten in the worst way possible. Footsteps came down the corridor. Fast, uneven, the sound of someone running against the flow of the crowd instead of with it. A woman appeared at the end of the hall, coughing into her sleeve, her eyes scanning every cage as she moved. Her name badge read Grace, and she worked in the medical wing, not the shelter block, which meant she had no reason to be here at all. She stopped in front of my cage. The door swung open on its broken lock, and she looked at me the way nobody ever had, not with fear, not with pity, but with pure urgency. "Can you walk?" she asked. I could barely stand. My wing had never healed right, and smoke was already thick enough to sting my throat. She did not wait for an answer. She stepped into the cage, wrapped one arm under my chest, and pulled me toward the door, with a strength that seemed impossible for someone her size. The corridor behind us collapsed a moment after we passed through it. Metal beams crashed down where we had been standing seconds before, and the sound of it chased us all the way to the stairwell. Grace did not stop moving. She kept one hand on my back, guiding me down each step, even as the building groaned around us, and emergency lights flickered on and off. We reached the ground floor as a second explosion rocked the building, somewhere near the old power generators. The blast threw dust and debris into the air, and Grace pulled me sideways into a supply room just as a support beam gave way outside the door. For a moment, we sat there in the dark, breathing hard, listening to chaos pass over us like a wave. "We are not staying here," she said, more to herself than to me. She found a service exit at the back of the supply room, one meant for deliveries, not evacuations, and forced it open with her shoulder. Cold night air rushed in, and for the first time in years, I felt open sky instead of a ceiling above me. She led me out through the loading yard, past overturned crates, and a fence with a gap just wide enough for both of us to slip through. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they were heading toward the shelter, not away from it, and Grace kept walking until the sound faded behind us. She did not have a plan. She told me that much honestly, once we were far enough away to stop and catch our breath under a bridge at the edge of the district. "I saw your file this morning," she said. "I was not even supposed to be in that building. I went in to check on a friend in the medical wing, and then the alarm went off, and I kept thinking about the block nobody was mentioning in the evacuation order. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, the way I always had. She did not seem to mind. She sat beside me under that bridge for the rest of the night, keeping watch, until the sky turned pale and the sirens finally stopped. The days after that were not calm. The shelter fire made the news, and questions started about how an unregistered animal had gone missing during the chaos. Grace kept me hidden in a small storage unit behind her apartment building, bringing food twice a day, checking my burns, wrapping the joint in my wing with a splint she built herself from spare materials. She lost sleep. She lost patience with coworkers who asked too many questions. She never once complained where I could hear her. On the fourth night, 2 officers came looking for the missing shelter animal. I heard their voices through the thin wall of the storage unit, asking Grace directly if she knew anything about it. My whole body went still. I remembered every lesson I had learned in that shelter about what happened to creatures who were inconvenient. Grace answered them calmly, telling them she had seen nothing unusual, that she had left the building the moment the alarm sounded like everyone else. Her voice did not shake. The officers thanked her and moved on to the next building, and I did not breathe properly again until their footsteps faded completely. When she came back inside, she sat down across from me and let out a long breath. "That cannot happen again," she said. "We need somewhere safer than this." She spent the next 2 weeks arranging something I did not understand until much later. A formal transfer request through a wildlife rescue program 2 districts away. One that dealt with exactly the kind of case files nobody else wanted to touch. She used her medical training to argue that my injuries required specialized care unavailable at the original shelter, and somehow, through more effort than I ever saw fully, she got the transfer approved under her own name as caretaker. The move itself was its own kind of danger. She could not use public transport with me, so she borrowed a delivery van from a neighbor named Daniel, who asked no questions, and simply handed her the keys with a nod. We drove through the night, avoiding the main roads after a checkpoint report came over the radio about unregistered wildlife transport in the district. Halfway through the drive, the van engine started sputtering, losing power on a stretch of road with nothing around us but dark fields. Grace pulled over, popped the hood, and worked by flashlight while I stayed hidden under a blanket in the back, listening to every passing car and praying none of them would stop. She got the engine running again, just as headlights appeared behind us, slow and steady, the kind of pace a patrol vehicle uses when it is checking a stopped car. She climbed back into the driver's seat without a word, pulled back onto the road, and kept her speed exactly steady, neither too fast nor too slow, until the headlights eventually turned off onto a different route. We reached the new shelter before sunrise. It was smaller than the first one, tucked behind a research building, run by people who looked at intake files the way Grace did, actually reading them instead of skimming a label. They took one look at my wing and started treatment that same morning. No hesitation, no argument about whether I was worth the effort. The recovery took months. There were setbacks, infections that needed stronger medicine, a night where my fever spiked so high that Grace stayed by my side until dawn, refusing to leave, even when the staff told her rest would help her more than staying would help me. She stayed anyway. There was one more scare near the end of it all, a routine records audit that flagged my case as unresolved from the original shelter fire. For 3 days, nobody knew if the audit would end with a transfer back to the district that had nearly gotten me killed, or a full closure of my file under Grace's care. She spent those 3 days making calls, gathering medical reports, building a case with numbers and evidence, instead of pleading with emotion, because she understood that emotion alone would not be enough to protect me from a system that only responded to paperwork. On the 3rd day, the audit closed in her favor. My case was marked resolved, permanent caretaker assigned, no further transfer required. When she told me the news, she did not celebrate loudly. She simply sat down next to me, the way she had that very first night under the bridge, and let out a breath that sounded like months of held tension finally leaving her body. After that, life became something I had never expected to have. Quiet mornings, a yard instead of a cage, a wing that had healed enough for short, careful flights, low and slow, but flights all the same. Grace built a routine around my needs without ever making me feel like a burden, and somewhere in that routine, the fear that had followed me since hatching finally started to fade. I think about that first night often, the sound of the alarm, the smoke, the sight of her running toward danger instead of away from it. Everyone else in that building ran for the exits. She ran the other way, toward a cage with a broken lock and an animal nobody thought was worth saving. She never asked what I could do for her. She never asked what use I would be. She asked if I could walk, and when I could not, she carried me anyway, through fire, through checkpoints, through every risk that came after, without once treating any of it as a burden. I am not the animal from Cage 9 anymore. I have a name now, given to me by someone who decided I was worth naming. I have a home that does not lock its doors out of fear, and a caretaker who proved, on the worst night of my life, that courage does not always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like one person walking into danger simply because leaving someone behind was never an option she was willing to consider.